The history of fantasy begins in the deepest layers of the human subconscious, within the dark caves of the past, where reality and imagination collide. Long before modern novels and epic films appeared, people told stories of gods and monsters inhabiting uncharted lands beyond the firelight, in the shadows of the night. These first tales weren't just bedtime stories. They were attempts to explain the unknown, to protect against fear, or to tame it through worship and sacrifice. Long before Tolkien created his famous Middle-earth, the ancient Sumerians inscribed strange beings onto clay tablets. Their Ushumgalu, giant dragon serpents, guarded forbidden knowledge deep beneath temple ziggurats. In the myths of Mesopotamia, these creatures were not fictions, but echoes of something people may have truly witnessed. Perhaps these tablets are the final remnants of memories from survivors of a catastrophe that reshaped the very nature of the world. The Assyrians and Babylonians told stories of powerful beings dwelling in the deepest parts of the earth. Their semi-divine Apkallu, teachers of mankind, brought wisdom and mysterious technologies. They came from beyond the waters, from lands that were destroyed or sank beneath the sea. What if these legends weren't pure imagination, but distorted memories of real events, of lost civilizations swallowed by disaster? Further north, in Celtic and Norse lands, similar figures appear. Legends tell of Alfar, the towering Jotnar, and the Draugr, beings who walk the boundary between life and death. The Norse believed that these creatures once lived alongside humans until some irreversible turning point changed the world forever. What if Ragnarok was not just a metaphor, but a record of a real cataclysm passed down through myth? Archaeologists and historians have uncovered eerie parallels between cultures that never had contact with one another. Across the world, legends persist of floods, lost knowledge, and entities that lived apart from humanity. Myths speak of battles among gods, fire from the heavens, and a great deluge. What if these recurring themes aren't coincidences? What if authors like Tolkien or Howard somehow tapped into a collective unconscious, one that holds scattered fragments of humanity's true past? Today, fantasy doesn't just entertain, it resonates. When people read about wizards, elves, and dragons, they feel something deeper than curiosity. It's as if they're remembering something long buried, hidden deep within the shared memory of our kind. And though we often dismiss such feelings as nostalgia or escapism, there lingers a quiet doubt. What if the world truly was once something else entirely? Perhaps ancient people witnessed things we now consider impossible. Perhaps they lived through an event so immense, so transformative, that the only way to preserve it was to encode it in legend. And those legends became the foundation of what we now call fantasy. A dark, alluring blend of truth and fiction, of reality and myth. Elves and other enigmatic beings, now icons of fantasy worlds, have deep roots in ancient cultures and mythologies across the globe. At first glance, these creatures may seem like mere products of imagination, yet their origins could be far more mysterious and darker than they initially appear. Take the enigmatic Picts, for example, a people who once inhabited the north of what is now Scotland. Their history is shrouded in mystery. They left behind strange stone pillars etched with indecipherable symbols that remain untranslated to this day. Roman sources describe them as small, swift warriors, nearly invisible in the dense forests, appearing suddenly, vanishing just as quickly. A few centuries later, they disappeared completely, leaving behind only legends of strange beings dwelling in barrows and woods, as if passing into the realm of spirits. Similar themes appear in Irish legends describing the Tuatha De Danann, a race said to have come from northern islands, bringing with them strange, nearly magical knowledge and technologies. They lived alongside ordinary humans, but after a great battle, retreated into the otherworld, into hills and mounds, becoming what are now known as the AOC. These tales closely resemble modern depictions of elves who dwell in parallel realms, occasionally interacting with humans. Norse sagas also feature the Alfar, tall, fair-haired beings of striking beauty, distant and dangerous. They rarely reveal their true intentions, remaining elusive and unpredictable. Their appearance and demeanor evoke an idealized version of humanity, as if they are echoes of a long-lost civilization more advanced than our own. Some suggest an alternate possibility. Perhaps these legends of small peoples and higher races are distorted memories of real historical events, witnessed by distant ancestors. Psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, archetypes that recur across cultures and pass through generations, even without direct contact. This implies that elves, AOC, Picts, and similar beings may not be inventions, but deeply rooted ancestral memories of humankind. It's possible that these memories were pushed out of conscious awareness after some great catastrophe, an event that rewired the very structure of human consciousness. Humanity may have once encountered higher beings or civilizations possessing knowledge and technologies far beyond our reach. Over time, that knowledge faded into myth, but the archetypes remained, surfacing in dreams, folklore, and ancient tales. Some even speculate that certain writers, like Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, or even Lovecraft, might have tapped, perhaps unknowingly, into that deep reservoir of ancestral memory. The worlds they created feel strangely familiar, as though drawn from fragments of a forgotten history. Their stories resonate with millions, not because they are imaginative, but because they awaken something buried, something real. Thus, elves, Picts, AOC, and other legendary beings may not be mere fantasy, but distant echoes of our collective memory. And it's precisely through that subtle link between myth and reality that fantasy gains its haunting power and depth. The image of orcs, demons, and savages has always held a special place in fantasy stories and ancient mythology. These beings often serve as central antagonists, embodying humanity's darkest fears. Yet the roots of such figures are far deeper and more complex than they may first appear. In the ancient world, people feared what they did not understand, creating depictions of terrifying creatures said to inhabit forests, caves, mountain ranges, and other wild places. To the Greeks and Romans, barbarians were simply anyone who lived beyond the borders of their own civilization. Over time, this fear of the other evolved into demonized images that would later be reflected in tales of goblins, trolls, and ogres. Medieval chronicles also preserved strange accounts of tribes living deep within the forests of Central and Eastern Europe. These people were often described as fierce, elusive, and aggressive, following customs that even hardened warriors found disturbing. It's entirely possible that these savages, as they were described, became the prototypes for the modern orcs and goblins found in the works of Tolkien and others. Across the folklore of many cultures, we find mention of forest or cave dwellers who practiced human sacrifice or attacked travelers. Shamanic cults that used terrifying masks and blood rituals created an atmosphere of dread and mysticism, intensifying fears of the unknown. Archaeological discoveries in caves across Europe and the Americas confirm that sacrificial practices did exist, providing historical foundations for such legends. But if we dig deeper, one might speculate that the images of orcs, goblins, and demons could be rooted in real historical events. After some cataclysm or major war, isolated groups of survivors may have been forced to hide in remote regions, becoming increasingly hostile and withdrawn due to scarcity and isolation. Over generations, these communities could have devolved, appearing monstrous to outsiders, who later passed down distorted tales of terrifying encounters. Human history retains echoes of encounters with peoples drastically different in culture, appearance, or language. Ancient Chinese chronicles, for example, mention mountain tribes with fearsome appearances and bizarre customs, speaking languages no one else could understand. These records gave rise to myths describing such tribes as demonic or non-human. In this light, orcs, demons, and wild men are not just imaginary constructs created for entertainment. They are shadows of ancient fears, embedded deep within humanity's collective memory. They symbolize our inner conflicts, our fear of what lies beyond the edge of the known. And perhaps it is precisely this primal resonance that makes them so powerful in today's culture. Still fascinating, still terrifying, and still very much alive. In fantasy, the image of humanity is often cast in the role of the hero, conqueror, or liberator. Humans are portrayed as the force that brings civilization, order, and light to worlds lost in chaos and darkness. But this idealized version of humanity has deep and conflicted historical roots that stretch from ancient empires to modern nation-states. Take, for example, the Roman conquests and the colonial campaigns of European powers. Frequently framed as missions of culture, civilization, and even salvation for savage peoples. Behind the mask of enlightenment, however, lay cruelty, exploitation, and the erasure of indigenous cultures and traditions. Fantasy has absorbed these historical dynamics into its narratives, often without realizing just how close to reality these so-called myths actually are. In the works of Tolkien, Howard, and many others, humanity is often depicted as a mighty force confronting evil, whether in the form of orcs, demons, or other dark creatures. But if we look more closely, these dark forces often mirror our own fears and sins. The fantasy worlds where humans battle monsters may in truth be symbolic landscapes reflecting both internal and external conflicts within our civilization. In Howard's tales, such as Conan the Barbarian, humanity is shown as an aggressive power, conquering foreign lands, seeking dominance and resources, and blurring the lines between good and evil. These stories echo real historical events in which empires destroyed local cultures and tried to erase the memory of conquered peoples. There's also the religious aspect to consider. Crusades and missionary campaigns, often presented as spiritual missions of salvation, were marked by violence and the destruction of those who refused to convert. These historical realities are mirrored in fantasy narratives, where noble heroes bring the light of truth to lands populated by dark beings, those who worship other gods or none at all. Tolkien himself, having survived the horrors of World War I, created a world where men, elves, and dwarves fight together against a single great evil, Morgoth and Sauron. But what if these villains are not true external threats, but rather reflections of human ambition, hatred, and lust for power? Fantasy, in this sense, becomes a mirror, revealing the darker aspects of human nature that we often choose to ignore in everyday life. Modern fantasy is increasingly challenging the idealized image of humanity as the righteous hero or savior. Writers now depict humans as complex beings, capable of both great deeds and horrific acts. This shift reflects a growing awareness of the complicated nature of human history and psychology, where there is no absolute good or evil, only choices made in difficult circumstances. Thus, humanity in fantasy is not just a symbol of civilization and progress. It is also a vessel for deep internal conflict, for historical memory of conquest and oppression. And perhaps it is this very ambiguity that makes fantasy so compelling, allowing us to reflect on real-world history through fictional narratives, and ultimately understand ourselves more deeply. The return of the dead, the reanimation of corpses, and beings suspended between life and death. These themes have long haunted human imagination. They've carved their place in modern fantasy as necromancers, zombies, and other undead entities. But the origins of these figures lie deep in the shadowed corners of history and the collective lore of many cultures. This fear of death and of the dead returning is not far removed from earlier depictions of the other, the foreign or unfamiliar, discussed previously. Like orcs or goblins, the undead embody our primal fear of what lies beyond control or comprehension, beyond the bounds of normal experience. Ancient civilizations already spoke of practices tied to resurrection or contact with the spirits of the dead. In Egyptian mythology, the Ka and Ba, two parts of the soul, were believed to live on after the death of the body. But the darkest and most enduring images of the undead are found in Slavic and Norse traditions, where belief in vampires and Draugr was deeply rooted. Slavic legends tell of Upiri, dead ones who rose from their graves at night to feast on the blood of the living. These were not merely monsters, but reflections of fear, of death, disease, and forces beyond understanding. Similar beliefs existed in Norse mythology, where the Draugr were restless dead who returned to the world of the living, often seeking revenge or resolution. Mentions of walking corpses also appear in ancient texts like the Icelandic saga of Grettir, which describes the hero's battle with a Draugr that haunted the night, bringing death to those it encountered. The tale is uncannily close to modern fantasy stories, many of which echo its tone and structure. The Bible, too, contains stories of resurrection and return from death. A raising of Lazarus stands as a symbol of life triumphing over death, but it also opens the door to darker reflections on what it means to rise again. Church teachings and folk beliefs alike have warned that resurrection can be a blessing or a curse, especially when brought about by unnatural or unholy means. Necromancy, the act of communing with the dead or raising them, was widespread in antiquity and the Middle Ages. Alchemists and mystics alike sought to summon the spirits of the departed or even reanimate corpses. These practices were condemned by religious and secular authorities alike, but their very repression only added fuel to the myths of the undead. From a psychological perspective, these legends and fears may stem from the collective memory and archetypes described by Carl Gustav Jung. He believed the fear of death and of the dead returning was a fundamental archetype shared by all of humanity. This might explain why undead figures are so persistent across cultures, regardless of geography or time period. Modern fantasy, by drawing on these ancient myths and forms, doesn't just terrify. It invites us to re-examine death itself, what lies beyond, and the threshold between worlds. Beings who return from the other side serve as reminders of humanity's age-old struggle to understand what happens after life ends. And perhaps that's why the undead remain so compelling in fantasy. They speak to that lingering question, that fear of the unknown, and open a door into a world where the boundary between life and death is far blurrier than we'd like to believe. All the previous images, archetypes, forgotten races, distorted enemies, heroic illusions, and the fear of death reanimated in the undead seem to converge on a single point, a sense that something has been lost, that once there existed another world, primal, deep, filled with magic, mystery, and forces now hidden from view. And so, the final note of this story is not about the past, but about the present, about how fantasy is returning to us in new forms. Modern fantasy is no longer just a genre. It's a worldview, one that grows through cinema, video games, books, comics, music, and sometimes even religion. In an age where science and logic have eclipsed intuition and belief, fantasy restores a sense of mysticism to the human spirit. It doesn't merely invite us to imagine another world. It reawakens collective memory, stirring something dormant within. The popularity of works like Game of Thrones, The Witcher, Elden Ring, and serialized Lord of the Rings adaptations is not a passing trend. It's a symptom, a sign that modern people, exhausted by algorithms, simulations, and sterile interfaces, are yearning for depth. Humanity longs to return to a stratum of existence where forest spirits whispered, creatures slumbered beneath mountains, and heroes bore both honor and the wrath of gods in their hearts. We no longer crave only logic. We crave belief, even if it comes dressed as fiction. Fantasy becomes a form of protest against the banal and mechanical. It says, the world's not flat. There are doors here, ones the body may never pass through, but the mind can. When we read about wizards, we don't feel curiosity. We feel resonance, as if something inside us already knew. Psychologists call it archetypes. But what if it's more than that? What if these aren't just psychic patterns, but imprints? Memories of what once was, of people who could speak with animals. Summon rain, or leave their bodies during sleep. Maybe we simply lost all of it. Some researchers of alternative history suggest that before the Great Catastrophe, the one remembered across cultures as the Flood, the world was different. Higher awareness, different relationships between people and nature, even a different sky. And if fantasy so precisely captures the texture of that forgotten world, perhaps the authors are unconsciously touching the remnants of something real. Perhaps that's why the works of Tolkien, Lovecraft, or Barker don't feel like invention, but recollection. Today, we are creating new magic through artificial intelligence, digital illusions, new languages, interactive worlds. The irony is, we use these tools to resurrect something ancient. We long to feel that the world breathes magic again, that darkness hides not only fear, but truth, that we can once again be part of a greater story. Fantasy does not flee from reality. It leads us back to a reality we can no longer see, and perhaps it will become the mirror through which we finally remember who we were and who we still might become.